Welkom bij inmiddels alweer de 8e lezing van de CIDI-informatiereeks. Mooi dat jullie allemaal weer meekijken. Dit is de 8e lezing van de CIDI-informatiereeks, een reeks van in totaal 11 lezingen georganiseerd door het CIDI elke woensdagochtend. Heeft u de eerdere lezingen gemist of wilt u die gewoon terugkijken? Dat kan via de verschillende CIDI-kanalen, bijvoorbeeld op YouTube, op het kanaal CIDI TV. Vandaag hebben we Dr. Jonathan Spire. Dr. Jonathan Spire is een van Israëls meest vooraanstaande experts op het gebied van strategische ontwikkelingen in het Midden-Oosten. Hij is onder meer verbonden aan het Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies en het Amerikaanse Middle East Forum. Hij publiceert regelmatig in verschillende vakbladen, zoals Jane's Intelligence Review en de Middle East Quarterly. Maar hij schrijft ook voor verschillende internationaal bekende kranten, zoals de Wall Street Journal en de Jerusalem Post. Mr. Jonathan Spire, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody, and good morning. What I'd like to do then over the next 45 minutes or so, before we begin our discussion, is the following. I want to, first of all, talk about what I see, at least, as the main trend lines and blocks and alliances active in our Middle East region on the strategic level. And I want to then, and I will then go on to highlight what seem to me to be 3 or 4 of the current key tactical, so to speak, processes taking place to keep our eye on here in our region. And we can then move on to focus on what people or interest people here in terms of discussion. I find this introductory element crucial because it seems to me that in order to understand the tactical processes and developments, one must first of all have a clear picture of the key strategic trends and players and groups of players. And that's what I'd like to now talk about. To begin then, let me say the following. In 2021 in the Middle East, we are in the midst of a profoundly changed and destabilized region. Now, it may sound like a cliche to describe the Middle East as destabilized, but one needs to consider this. The fact is that while the Middle East may have been torn by war and by societal and socio-economic failure for the greater part of the period post-1945, it is a fact, nevertheless, that for the greater part of that period, at least from the 1950s until about 10 years ago, there was relative internal political stability in the greater number of the countries of the Arabic-speaking world. That is to say, regimes were profoundly unsuccessful, according to most of the measures applied to them. But nevertheless, they tended to stay in place. There was a kind of stagnant stability that was notable in the Arabic-speaking world. Now, in the last 10 years, that stagnant stability has been torn wide open. And it's been torn wide open by a whole series of revolutions, civil wars, counter-revolutions, in some cases also electoral processes that have profoundly weakened the Arab states system. The process initially misnamed the Arab Spring, nobody uses that term anymore, but the period that began with the demonstrations and then the revolution in Tunisia in late 2010 spread rapidly, of course, to Egypt, then to Syria, to Yemen, and to Libya, has resulted in a process of state collapse, partial or total, across a broad swathe of the Arab world, such that if we look at a number of important Arab countries of long standing today, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon in an extent also, what we see today is that the state has partially or completely collapsed, that a kind of confused conflict of succession is going on within the borders of the notional state, and that powerful states and state alliances are seeking to gain advantage within that confused space. This is an unprecedented situation in the Arabic-speaking world. We've seen nothing like this, arguably since the birth of the current Middle East following the collapse of Ottoman Empire. So we're living in a profoundly disturbed space at the present time. Now, this is the first point. Second point is that, of course, not all states have collapsed and not all states have been weakened. Rather, there remain powerful states, which are today the dominant forces in the region, competing with one another over this partially collapsed space. Who are the three most powerful states in the region today, around which power constellations are gathering, which we'll go on to explore in a moment? I would argue that there are three such states, and they are the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Republic of Turkey, and the State of Israel. One thing which people will already immediately note from this short list of powerful, consequential states in the region is that these three states happen to also be the only three non-Arab states in the region. A fact, by the way, which is not lost on Arab political discussion, and which is something which comes up again and again in Arabic discussion at the journalistic and media and elite level. Now, it seems to me that what we are witnessing in the region today is the coming together and competition of powerful alliance blocs gathered and gathering around these three powerful states, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, and competition between these three, and sometimes cooperation is between one or other of these forces, is going to be the key strategic dynamic in the region, which I want to go on now to explore. Before I do so, and before I go on to look in detail at these three alliances, let me make the following crucial points. On the global level today, global affairs are characterized, in my view, by a single salient process. And that process is the gradual retreat of the United States of America from the role that it has played since 1945 as the guarantor of the international system. It's not that America has retreated in its entirety from that role, but America is in a process of recalibrating that role in the face of renewed great power competition with the rise of China and the partial rise of Russia. And this is having a profound effect everywhere, and it is having a profound effect on the Middle East. And the salient profound effect is that, contrary to the last 20 years in which the Middle East has featured as central and primary in the concerns of American policymakers, this is no longer the case. And we are emerging into a world in which the Middle East is third or maybe fourth on the list of United States and American policy priorities. So that's an intro. Now, with regard to the emergent alliances in competing in the confused, partially collapsed space of the Middle East, as I said, Israel, Turkey, and Iran are the most powerful countries. What are the alliances, and who are the members of the alliances gathering around them? Let me look at Israel first of all, since Israel is, I think, of central concern to all of us gathered in this discussion today. You know, people have talked about an alliance of moderate or pro-Western countries in the region of which Israel is a member for many years now. And I used to be one of those people that was very skeptical about this. And I would try and, in a sense, pour cold water on these claims of Israel as part of an emergent alliance, including former Arab enemies. And I would say, yeah, if you actually look for the signs of this alliance, if you actually look for the deep connections between these countries and their cooperation, you find a much more ad hoc map of partial cooperation on a bilateral level between a number of countries, which does not yet deserve to be dignified with the term alliance. I would like to partially take back that general assessment in light of the events of the last year, specifically in the light of the Abraham Accords. the accords of normalization between Israel and four significant Arab countries, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, but maybe most importantly, United Arab Emirates. In this process of normalization, what we see, in my view, are the first seeds of a new defense alliance in the region, in which in the case of United Arab Emirates, one of the most dynamic and powerful economies in the region, in the case of Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, significant Arab states are cleaving towards Israel and towards alliance with Israel as a result of shared concerns, shared enemies, and a shared acknowledgement of Israel's salient strength and power in the region in the context of a retreating United States. Let me once again reiterate that final point. This is made possible because of the context of the retreating American hegemon, which makes, for countries like United Arab Emirates, it a matter of urgency to cleave towards a powerful regional partner in order to ensure safety against powerful regional foes. In the case of United Arab Emirates, the foes being, of course, Iran and Turkey. So I think that we can say today in early 2021 that we have the beginnings of a defensive alliance in which Israel is a primary part and in which we also see powerful Arab states. And I think that the Abraham Accords are a key milestone on that road. Of course, before I go on to that, of course, Egypt and Jordan would also be very significant members of that emergent alliance. The key prize for that alliance will be, of course, if it can be achieved, the entry of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia into that gathering. But I would suggest that in many ways, de facto, if not yet de jure, Saudi Arabia is on the way towards the membership in that putative alliance, given the very similar analysis of threats and opportunities which we can find between Riyadh and Jerusalem in the current period. And I would suggest that the very notable coolness, if I can put it that way, of the new Biden administration towards the current de facto power in Saudi Arabia, that of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, may well serve to intensify and accelerate the process whereby Saudi Arabia moves towards Israel and towards the emergent defensive alliance in the region, in which Israel stands at the center as the most powerful single member of that emergent alliance. Thus far then, with regard to the Israeli side and pro-Israel, Israel associated side of the emergent power contest in the region. Let me turn briefly to look at the two other members, or two other factors in this process, Iran and Turkey. Each of these, by the way, have their strengths and their vulnerabilities, which we will consider this morning. With regard to Islamic Republic of Iran, there is a very particular strength that Iran brings to the table in this contest, and that is its unrivaled abilities in proxy warfare, a matter of particular relevance in the current fragmented Middle East. Who would we consider to be the members of Iran's alliance? Well, Iran itself, of course, the Assad regime in Syria, which Iran saved or helped to save in the brutal civil war in Syria over the last 9 years now. The Hezbollah-dominated space, which is called Lebanon. The Shia militia, Iran-associated Shia militia-dominated space, which is called Iraq, and the Ansar Allah or Houthi movement, which controls the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, and a large swathe of the territory of Yemen, And as a junior partner, we would include the Islamic Jihad movement among the Palestinians, not the Hamas movement, by the way, which should not be considered, in simple terms at least, as part of the pro-Iran group. Now, what is this matter of proxy warfare that I mentioned, and how does it give Iran this advantage, which I mentioned? In the organizational shape of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and its expeditionary Quds force, Iran possesses a unique state body whose specific skill set is the raising up of proxy political and military organizations in neighboring countries that they might serve the interests of Iran. This is an unusual type of organization. Most countries don't have bodies of this type. Countries have armies, countries have intelligence bodies, but countries don't usually have large bureaucracies and organizations committed and skilled in the process of proxy warfare. Iran does. And in the framework of the collapsed and fragmented spaces of the Middle East that I mentioned at the beginning, the possession of an organization with this skill set and capacity is of tremendous assistance, of tremendous benefit to the state that possesses it. Iran has such an organization, no other regional state does. And as a result, we can see the way in which the Iranians have been able to organize in the collapsed spaces. First of all, in Yemen, in Lebanon, which was the first of these Arab states to collapse all the way back in the 1980s. And we see the establishment and control of Lebanese Hezbollah as a long-term Iranian investment, which now is the dominant political and military power in Lebanon. Yeah, we see in Yemen, not the creation, but the sponsorship of the local, homegrown Ansar Allah, Houthi, Shia insurgency from the north of the country, and the use of that tool in order to grab control now of the greater part of the north of that country. And the Houthis are currently engaged in an underreported offensive against the oil town of Marib in central Yemen, which, if they capture it, will give the Houthis control of the oil of Yemen and will set them in good stead for further offensives southwards. In Iraq, we see the creation of the Shia militias, the Hashd al-Sha'bi, popular mobilization units by Iran during the ISIS war in 2014, and subsequently the use of those forces to achieve a kind of de facto domination of Iraq, which we can discuss later if people want to. In Syria, again, the mobilization of the Revolutionary Guards Corps provided the key infantry forces that Assad was lacking in and saved his regime from destruction in the 2013 to 2015 period. Again, that Iranian skill set coming into play crucially at that point. Now, here's a crucial issue to bear in mind. Iran is not a rich country. Iran is a third world country. Iran is still under major sanctions, at least for now. So Iran doesn't have an endless set of skill sets. It has one skill, really, which is skill in proxy warfare. It's weak in every other area: conventional military defense, economic power, societal power, inner stability, and so on and so forth. It has one very crucial skill, and this is what is bringing it benefit in the current space of the Middle East. I'm reminded of the Russian-Jewish-British political philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who talked about the hedgehog and the hare in the race. And he said the hare is the one that knows many things. The hedgehog knows one big thing, right? The Iranians are the hedgehog in this analogy. They don't know many things, but the one thing which they know, which is proxy warfare, is immensely of benefit to them. Thus far, with regard to the Iranian alliance and the Iranian challenge to the Israel-led group, which we mentioned at the beginning. Turkey and its allies. A more complex picture in the sense that Turkey is, of course, still a NATO member in good standing, is still an applicant for membership of the European Union, and is still a country which has formal diplomatic relations and a burgeoning trade relationship with the State of Israel. And nevertheless, I would argue that Turkey and its allies are embarked on a similar project to that of the Iranians, in the sense of the desire to emerge as the replacement hegemon for retreating America in the region. And if we think of Turkey and its ally Emirate of Qatar and its close ally, the Hamas movement in the Gaza Strip and among the Palestinians, we can see a kind of parallel Sunni Islamist project to the Shia Islamist project of Iran. When it comes to proxy warfare, the Turks are getting in the business. They're not as experienced as the Iranians are, but if we think of the region over the last year and a half now, COVID-19 tends to make me not notice 2020, so I forget that a year has in fact passed, but it has. So the last year and a half now, we can see a number of Turkish successes in this field, which we should note. Firstly, the two invasions of northern Syria that the Turks have carried out in alliance with their Syrian Sunni Islamist allies, the people that we used to call the Syrian rebels, and their carving out of a de facto area of control in northwest Syria, comprising around 10% of the territory of that country, which is now to all intents and purposes Turkish territory. Turkish school system is being set up there, the Turkish mail system is being set up there, Turkish policing system is being established there, the Turkish currency is in circulation there. So an initial success close to home in carving out the proxy dominated area in northern Syria. And then, fascinatingly, the employment by Turkey of this paramilitary capacity in two subsequent conflicts in Libya in the course of last year, and at the end of last year in Azerbaijan, in Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkey utilized these proxy paramilitary capacities as part of a power assertion underway by the Erdogan government, with the intention of resulting, I would argue, in an expanded Turkish power space within the region and indeed beyond it, into the Southern Caucasus, into Azerbaijan. Turkey, unlike Iran, is an economically strong country with a powerful economy, with a basically Western socioeconomic setup. And this gives Turkey, I would say, a kind of soft power appeal, which the Iranians do not have, and which we will need to pay close attention to, especially when we note, sitting here in Jerusalem, the Turkish stated ambitions with regard to Jerusalem and with regard to the Palestinian issue, and the very close and real assistance now being afforded by Turkey to the Hamas movement in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, and to Islamist forces in Jerusalem. This is an emergent challenge to Israel of a kind which the Iranians do not present, and which we will need to think very carefully about. We should note, by the way, that Iran and Turkey are not allies, and the notion that we are facing a kind of united Islamist alliance is something which we need to complicate. Anybody who looks at the map of Iraq and looks at the area of Sinjar Mountain will note that the Turkish army was engaged just a couple of weeks ago in the area of Ghada in an extensive raid into an area controlled by the Iran-backed Shia militias, who are now mobilizing in that area to prevent what they fear may be a subsequent Turkish incursion. So the natural state of Turkey and of Turkish and of Iran alliances, even though they may cooperate in certain areas against common enemies, is one of competition in this region. Lastly, in terms of the map of alliances, we shouldn't forget, though they're not key at the moment, we shouldn't forget the activities of the Salafi jihadi groups, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. These are not states, of course, but they are region-wide powerful networks of fighters and of resources. And we should not forget them, because there are in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon and beyond large populations of young Sunni Arabs who have emerged as the losers in the contests of the last decade in the region, who are angry, who are dispossessed, and who therefore may well prove a ready audience for the arguments and for the claims of organizations like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State in some future period. Right now, Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are relatively weak, but we shouldn't forget about them if we're considering matters in this area. Lastly, then, for the last 15-20 minutes, I would like now to consider a number of latest developments in our region and the possible implications within this broader picture that I've been trying to describe. Firstly, and most importantly, we need to consider the actions and attitudes of the emergent Biden administration in our region and the effects that this is having. And most specifically, I would suggest, with regard to Iranian ambitions in the region. As we know, the Trump administration quit the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, a year after coming into, or 2 years after coming into office in 2018, and began a process of maximum pressure, as they called it, of sanctions against Iranian activities in the region. The Iranians responded by partially, but not totally, departing from the agreement itself, and by beginning, so they say, uranium enrichment of up to 20%. The agreement permits them to enrich up to only 3.67%. And with the coming, or with the arrival of Biden, what we see clearly and statedly is a very clear goal of the administration to return to the agreement as soon as possible. As of now, there is disagreement between the United States administration and the Iranians regarding the terms that can even begin the negotiation of a return to the agreement. The Iranians are insisting on the removal of all sanctions prior to beginning discussion regarding return to the agreement. The Americans are insisting on the return of Iran to full compliance with the agreement prior to discussions beginning. So as of now, we're in the opening moves of this dance, so to speak. But the important point to note is the following. There is a clear Iranian perception that this administration is less keen to confront it in the full gamut of its activities across the region than was the previous administration. And as a result, what we can see is a whole series of acts of aggression taking place on the ground across the region by the Iranians, with the intention, I would suggest, of testing the new administration, or hopefully perhaps railroading it in to a rapid abandonment of its conditions for a return to the JCPOA, a rapid re-signing of the prior agreement, and then a rapid removal of the sanctions, which are certainly impacting very heavily on the Iranian economy and society. And if we think of the events that have taken place just in the last month, the assassination of the anti-Hezbollah dissident, Lokman Salim, Shia anti-Hezbollah dissident on the streets of Beirut just a month ago now, the series of attacks, rocket attacks by Shia militias on US positions and bases in Iraq. And by the way, just this morning, there was an additional attack on the Ain al-Assad base, 10 missiles launched at the American base in Ain al-Assad in Iraq. But of course, in Balad also, and on February 26th in Erbil, at the airport in Erbil against the United States facility, one person killed, contractor, not an American. We're seeing the Iranians testing the limits of US tolerance and a process of intimidation. I mentioned the offensive in Marib in Yemen. Again, a process of sudden push forward by the Iran-associated forces. Put that together with, from Yemeni soil, a series of attacks on Saudi Arabian positions, including the airport over the last month. And what we see is a kind of full court press, I would suggest, whereby the Iranians, sensing that this is an administration that doesn't want to get sucked back into the Middle East, and that will do everything that it can to avoid getting sucked back into the Middle East. They're pushing forward with the intention of saying to the Americans, look how much trouble you encounter when you try to set conditions for what we should or should not do. Wouldn't it be easier for you, especially since we know you don't want to be in the Middle East, to just quickly abandon the sanctions, re-sign on the previously existing nuclear agreement, and then we can all go back to doing what we prefer doing? Now, this is a matter of great concern to Israel and its allies, including Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and the others that we discussed, or I mentioned earlier, because from an Israeli point of view, the notion of a return to previously existing JCPOA without any reference to the Iranian ballistic missile program and without any reference to the Iranian regional activities that I discussed earlier would be a disastrous situation when we consider that any newly signed agreement will, of course, include the removal of the current sanctions, which are the only barrier to Iranian activities currently underway. So there is deep concern from Jerusalem, so to speak, with regard to the American response to all this. And I would imagine, or I can even say with confidence, that discussions behind the scenes between Secretary of State Blinken and senior people in Israel are no doubt taking place with regard to this file, so to speak. This, I think, then is the key process to have opened up in the last month or so. And everything else is kind of, in a way, contained within that broad heading, so to speak. Nevertheless, we should note a number of other events, which are perhaps also related to this. First of all, I think very importantly from an Israeli point of view, the explosion that took place on the cargo ship, the MV Helios Ray, on February 26th, is something which will no doubt be giving Israeli planners pause to think in the days ahead. We're now hearing that this explosion, which tore a hole in the ship's side without causing a loss of life, was the result of the placing of limpet mines on the ship, almost undoubtedly by fighters, soldiers of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Now, in doing this, first of all, Israel retaliated. Of course, there was a bombing south of Damascus in Syria a couple of days afterwards. But this incident should be cause for concern in Israel for the following reason. Firstly, it's clear that the Iranians had, if you can put 2 limpet mines on a ship, you can put 5 or 10. That's to say, the Iranians were sending a message. They weren't trying to sink the ship. They could have sunk the ship, but they understand if they'd sunk the ship, it would have been war, and they're not looking for war right now. But they did demonstrate to Israel, look what we can do to your ships on the high seas coming through the Gulf. And this is a vulnerability which will be of considerable importance to Israel to try to seek a solution to. Because Israel, as we know from the recent killing, for example, of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in Tehran a couple of months ago, the senior Iranian nuclear scientist, Israel is engaged in an ongoing campaign to try to frustrate and turn back Iranian ambitions in the nuclear area with regard to entrenchment in Syria, with regard to arming its proxies in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And the Iranians have been looking for a way to retaliate, and they've not yet found it for a long period. And it may well be that on 26th of February of this year, the Iranians demonstrated, okay, we found a point of vulnerability, which is crucial, of course, to the Israeli economy, namely the ability to transfer cargo by sea to Israeli ports, and or indeed from Israel to client and customer ports. And we can hit at that. So this is something which I think is important to bear in mind. Lastly, perhaps before we move on to discussion, we need to also note the importance of internal stability and internal societal cohesion with regard to this whole matter of the emergent contest in the Middle East. In this regard, Israel gets good marks, but I would say not excellent marks. We are currently, on March 23rd, we are due to have our fourth general election in the space of 2 years. This is as a result of a process of political instability that was initiated by the fact that we have a prime minister who is under 3 charges of criminal indictment. And it is not at all clear, at least from the opinion polls, and we can discuss this in greater detail in a moment, it is not at all clear that the elections in March 23rd will produce a coherent government. Now, I'm of course, and no one here is interested in trying to apportion blame or guilt to any figure, and the notion of innocent until proven guilty is a crucial element of any democratic judicial system. But it is a fact that for as long as powerful political forces in Israel are not prepared to sit with a prime minister under criminal indictment, then political stability in our country is likely to continue to be elusive. This is a matter of real importance. It's a matter of real concrete importance because we don't have a working budget. We haven't had a working budget now in our country for nearly 2 years. But it's also important on a broader level, I would suggest, because when faced with such challenges as the coronavirus pandemic, but also the strategic challenges facing Israel with regard to the things I've been discussing for the last half hour, the need for at least a base level amount of political and governmental stability is at a premium. You cannot address crucial national challenges at the same time when those tasked with managing that response are busy with internal political wrangling. There's a reason why election campaigns in most countries, most democracies, only last a month or so. And it's because when politicians are busy with election campaigns, they tend to not be able to be busy with much else. But if you have a country which is involved in a kind of endless election campaign for 2 years, this can only hit at the capacity and possibility of an adequate response. And internal stability and internal societal cohesion are a crucial part of this broader discussion of who will be strong and who will be less strong in this emergent challenge. Lastly, the issue which I would like just again to draw our attention to, because we shouldn't ignore it in its entirety, is the Israeli-Palestinian arena. Arguably, all the events that I've been discussing this morning up until now have together, what I mean by that is the rise of Iran, the rise of Turkey, the decline of American hegemony, the resultant drawing together of Israel and a number of key Arab states, the weakening of the Arab state system. All of these factors together have jointly contributed to the very significant decline in the centrality and importance of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, both on a symbolic level and on a practical level over the last 10 years. And I think this is a crucial point to bear in mind. I was in a discussion with some Gulf friends via Zoom, of course, inevitably yesterday, and a number of them made the point that there is today a generation in the Arab world which is already in adulthood, which has not grown up in a situation in which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was regarded as front and center of their political considerations. And this is a matter of real and perhaps profound importance moving forward. Having said that, we need to note, and this is the point I want to note, that the Palestinians are currently trying their best to get their act together. And later this year, if they indeed take place, which is not yet a certainty, but later this year in July and in August, we are due for Palestinian presidential elections, and then a month later, at the end of August, for Palestinian parliamentary elections, the first ones for 15 years. And this is something to bear in mind. The Palestinians certainly think that the emergence of the Biden administration with the kind of considerations of importance in parts of the Democratic Party in the US today offers an opportunity for them, and that they will have the chance, or should have the chance, to try to push their agenda and their demands back to the center of the discussion. Now, I don't think that will take place because I think that the profoundly important structural changes I mentioned a moment ago will limit the possibility of such a return. But nevertheless, we should not be complacent. There is a tendency, I think, in Israel or in parts of Israel and pro-Israel, I can say, circles today, to say, well, we've kind of, we've managed to push that issue to the back burner. There are so many more urgent things to be concerned about. So let's not worry too much about that. Let's not worry too much about it, of course, but let us also not be complacent in assuming that the split in Palestinian politics is forever, that we will always be able to use that as a working assumption, and so on and so forth. So this then was an additional area which I wanted to mention. And in that regard, let me also mention the matter of the decision of the International Criminal Court in recent weeks to permit itself, so to speak, to open criminal investigations against Israelis and Palestinians, it says, accused of war crimes. This is something, again, which the Palestinian Authority and its allies will be trying very hard to work with. The court has not yet decided to launch any investigations, but again, it's something which we should not be complacent about. We should be thinking very carefully about it, and I would suggest that friends in Europe and in Western Europe especially may well have an important role to play in what may emerge in that regard. So to conclude then, let me sum up by saying the following, and going back to where I started, so to speak. The collapse and fragmentation of the Arab state system represents an enormous opportunity for Israel. The fact is that what this collapse is all about is it is about history delivering a negative verdict on the Arab states system in the post-colonial period, in terms of economy, in terms of society, in terms of military organization, and so on. We, as the target of that state system when it was strong, and target we were, central target, can only benefit from its collapse and its weakening. And the fact that new enemies have emerged, and the fact that these enemies are common to us and to the key states of the Arab world today, which are Egypt and Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned before, plus the other smaller countries, is a matter of enormous opportunity for Israel. And it is, I would say, central to the Israeli strategic agenda to move forward and try to gain benefit from that process. This is firstly. Secondly, and one before the end, so to speak, the risks which emerge from this picture are serious indeed. They are not existential risks. In other words, there is today, perhaps for the first time in its existence over the last 10, 15 years now, there has been no existential challenge facing Israel. There are real and profound security challenges. None of them threaten to destroy the state of Israel in its entirety. And for as long as the Iranian nuclear ambition remains only an ambition, that will continue to be the case, which means that Israel is in a promising shape, I would say, in the period now opening up. The United States, our patron and ally, is in retreat, but we, unlike some of the weaker American partners in the region, don't face an existential threat as a result of that. On the contrary, in fact, it brings opportunity for us because some of the former weaker partners of America are now flocking towards our banner in the search for safety and security, no longer available to them, they think, under the stars and stripes. This offers opportunity. So Israel is doing well. Israel is in good shape. The region is profoundly changing. The region is in very poor shape. It's in ruins, in fact. There are those who are coming to seek advantage among the ruins. But we, if we play our cards right, and most important, maybe very importantly, if we can maintain internal political and societal cohesion, are fair placed to emerge into, I would say, into very promising waters, so to speak, in the period ahead, depending on the capacity of our decision-making echelon to see opportunity and to act upon it in good time. So on that note, I will conclude, and I look forward to questions and comments in our discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Speyer. As Dr. Speyer mentioned, you can now pose questions. If you are on Zoom, you can do that in the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. We already have a number of questions. The first question that was posted was, would you agree that Turkey lacks the religious component of attraction to the Arabs, and bearing in mind mutual historical resentment, has no significant chance to gain significant influence in the Arab world?
Question was that Turkey lacks the religious component?
Yeah, that's what is asked.
Yes,
would you agree that Turkey lacks a religious component of attraction to the Arabs?
Yeah, I would partially agree, but not totally. I mean, specifically with regard to the religious component, I would say actually no, that Turkey does have the religious advantage with regard to a potential appeal to Arab sensibilities, precisely because what Turkey has in common with the great majority of the Arabic-speaking populations of the region is that they're all Sunni Muslims. And indeed, this is precisely the nature of the appeal that President Erdogan is trying to make to the Arab world. He's saying what we have in common is that we are all Muslims, Sunni Muslims, but he would say Muslims, you know, and Turkey is a country, is perhaps the only country which can successfully defend Islamic dignity in a number of crucial areas. For example, he talked a lot about Jerusalem. And he says, we are the ones who can defend Jerusalem from those who are trying to occupy it. This is soft power, and it's worth considering. I live in Jerusalem, and I've lived here for most of my life. And I can tell you that we note Turkish soft power activity here in the city in terms of reviving of mosques, in terms of cultural activity, all towards the notion of Al-Aqsa Mosque as a common goal, and the return of Muslim sovereignty to Al-Aqsa Mosque as a common goal. And if we think of Turkish support for Hamas, we can put that into the same general category. Having said that, I think I do agree with a large part of the question, which is that at the end of the day, in spite of this notable religious soft power that exists, Turkey also has very major limitations and disadvantages when it comes to its appeal to the Arab world, both in this neighborhood and more broadly. Namely, that at the end of the day, the Turks are not Arabs, and Arabs are not only and solely motivated, though they are certainly informed by, their Muslim identity. Turks are the inheritors of a former imperial power, which dominated for half a millennium in the main spaces of the Arabic-speaking world, and which is not remembered by any means as a benevolent, necessarily as a benevolent or wise ruler, to put it mildly. Any Turkish government making an appeal to the Arab world comes with the burden of its identity as the inheritor of an imperial power that dominated over the Arabs. And this, I think, is and will be a profound limitation in this area. As of now, look, Erdogan has been in power now for the best part for nearly 2 decades. And if we think of the extent of his success or otherwise in appealing to the Arab world, we can see that the results are very limited until now. Some support for Hamas, some grandstanding with regard to flotillas towards Israel a decade ago, which have now been discontinued. The use of some very unfortunate and poverty-stricken Syrians as cannon fodder, essentially for Erdogan's imperial adventures. And that's pretty much as far as it goes. So, you know, I think they do have some appeal. I wouldn't want to discount the religious element specifically, but there are certainly very, very severe limitations, which I think have played out in practice over the last decade and a half in this regard.
You've mentioned that Turkey is cooperating with Israel in terms of trade and possible even in an informal military ad hoc alliance. Yet, on the other hand, Erdogan's regime is, as you mentioned, supporting Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So what are Turkey's goal in supporting Hamas? And somebody asks as well, would Turkey possibly be willing to help promote peace between Israel and the Palestinians?
With regard to Israel's relations and with Turkey, de facto military alliance, no. I mean, there's not. What notably, there was in the late 1990s, an emergent de facto military alliance between Israel and Turkey. And as a very young and junior press officer of the Israel government press office in the late 90s, I was one of the people who handled the press element of the first joint Israeli-Turkish naval exercise, Haifa, Operation Reliant Mermaid in the Mediterranean in 1998, I believe. And then we saw this as an emergent military, very promising military alliance between Israel and Turkey. And it was. The collapse of the peace process in 2000, and then the emergence of AKP, of Erdogan's party, to power in 2002 and 2004, ended that. And today, the military component of the relationship is down to close to zero. Having said that, there is a burgeoning trade relationship, which I mentioned. To some degree, this is also a product of the collapse and fragmentation of the Arab world, of the Arab space. In what way? Well, Turkey is a country that has an extensive manufacturing industry. They produce stuff in Turkey. In large parts of the Arab world, they don't produce very much, but they have a lot of money, which means they need stuff. This is a good meeting. And as a consequence, the Persian Gulf, the Arab Gulf states, are major purchasers of Turkish goods. Now, you need to get the goods from Turkey down to Saudi Arabia, for example. How do you do it? Well, when things are stable, you could do it by taking the goods through Syria, through Iraq, and then down to Saudi Arabia. But for the last decade or so, that's been completely impossible. As a result of that, the Turks have found an alternative route. And that route is that you sail the goods down the Mediterranean to Haifa port, then you transport them by land through Israel, through Jordan, and then to Saudi Arabia. That has been a very important lifeline, if I can put it that way, for Turkish exports to the Gulf over the last 10 years. And that has continued to flourish regardless of the fairly dreadful state of diplomatic relations between Israel and Turkey during the same period. And that, I think, will continue to flourish. At the end of the day, from an Israeli point of view, it's a benefit. They have to pay to use the port. And if they're willing to do that, then, well, fine, very good. And if they want to say nasty things at the same time about Israel, it's not nice, but we can live with it. The problem with all that picture is, of course, the practical support afforded to the Hamas movement, which has been, and I want to stress to people just how serious this has been. There are those who believe, with good reason, that the kidnapping of the two and murder of the young Israeli boys in the summer of 2014, which launched the Gaza operation of that summer, was planned and was devised and planned and overseen from the Hamas cell run by a man called Salah al-Aruri inside Turkey. Right? So this is not only about propaganda activities, it's about active operational Hamas activity managed from Turkey. This is not acceptable from an Israeli point of view. And for as long as this continues, and it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, even though the Turks claim to have closed down the Istanbul office, this is not true in its entirety. As long as this continues, there's no chance of an improved relationship. Why are the Turks doing this, was the question? Well, it goes back to our first question, right, with regard to the Turkish attempt to appeal to the Arab world. The Turks believe, and to some extent may be right, that the Palestinian cause remains a matter of some importance to large swathes of the Arabic-speaking world, especially the Sunni Arabic-speaking world, and they want, therefore, to present themselves as the people who can effectively engage on behalf of the Palestinians. And Hamas is a natural partner for Erdogan because both of their parties emerge from the Muslim Brotherhood, from an essentially similar conservative Islamist outlook. And therefore, I think that this is the basis for the involvement, and it has been an extensive involvement. Now, with regard to peace, or any peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, or perhaps between, let's say, Hamas-controlled Gaza and Israel, undoubtedly Turkey would like to play that role. That's exactly the way that Turkey wants to present itself. Unlike Iran, yeah? Turkey would like to say, no, we are a strong supporter of the Palestinians. We also are able to talk to the Israelis, so we can get the kind of results that the Palestinians want or need from the Israelis. From an Israeli point of view, there is an absolute determination to keep the Turks out of any diplomatic process, because, of course, we understand that this Turkish government is not a friend of Israel on any level. And indeed, the Turks tried, if you remember, to engage in 2012 in the negotiation between Israel and Gaza that followed the military operation of that year. And Israel was very keen to keep them out. And in 2014, Israel showed that the partner it prefers, for good reason, to be the mediator between Gaza and Israel is Egypt. Egypt is the one that Israel wants, because Egypt is a government that Israel feels it's able to trust. So the Turks definitely want to be involved. Their motivation for that is clear. Israel will do everything possible to keep them out, at least for as long as Erdogan is president. If the CHP win elections scheduled for 2023, it'll be a whole different ballgame, but I think that's quite unlikely.
And continuing on Turkey, what is the current situation in Rojava? Are the Kurdish people and their leadership still attempting to form an autonomous society there? Because you also have a Turkish acquired region in northern Syria.
Yes.
Does Turkey also aspire to reach the oil fields in northern eastern Syria?
Interesting. Well, the state of affairs, I can deal with this in some detail because maybe some people are aware, I've worked quite extensively in that area for the last 7 years, and I was one of the first Western journalists to enter Rojava back in early 2013. Enter it since it was taken over by the Kurdish de facto authority there. The situation over the last 2 years has been one in which Kurds have been pushed back significantly by the Turks. There was a real possibility up until late 2017 that the Kurds were going to manage to unite, to create a physical connection between all three of their enclaves in northern Syria. The enclave, which we call Rojava, or the enclave east of Euphrates, then the Kobani enclave, and then the Afrin enclave in the northwestern area. Now, had the Kurds been able to do that, and they thought they were within striking distance of that, the prospect then of pushing Afrin further west a little bit and reaching the sea would not have been completely unimaginable from a Kurdish point of view. And this would have represented a very, very impressive strategic gain for the Kurds. Don't forget that Kurdish area of control is contiguous into northern Iraq. Of course, Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq and the people who run the Rojava don't speak to each other. It's the usual Kurdish business. But nevertheless, this area is under Kurdish control. So if the Kurds had reached the Mediterranean and Afrin, you would have had a situation of de facto Kurdish control all the way from the Mediterranean coast west of Afrin, across northern Syria, across northern Iraq, all the way to the border between Iraq and Iran. It would have been a very, very powerful move forward from a Kurdish point of view. Turkey noticed that, unsurprisingly, and was determined to prevent it. And essentially, in 3 military operations over the last 4 years, it has prevented. The most important ones taking place over the last 2 years. In 2018, the Turkish army destroyed and occupied the Afrin enclave in the northwest of Syria. There was significant ethnic cleansing that took place. Between 200,000 and 300,000 Kurds left their homes. And Afrin is now part of that 10% of Syria controlled by Turkey and its Islamist allies. First break. Secondly, in late 2019, following apparently a conversation between Erdogan and President Donald Trump, or then President Donald Trump, the Turkish army pushed into the eastern part of Kurdish domination, and they have established an area of de facto Turkish control 30 kilometers into the Kurdish area of domination between Ain Issa in the west and Tel Tamer in the east. The Kurds were forced to ask the Russians and the Assad regime east of the Euphrates to help them block the Turkish advance. I was there, actually, I came to report it at that time, and I was on the front lines there. And they managed to halt the advance, but the result is that the once contiguous or near contiguous Kurdish enclave now has great huge holes in it, which will prevent any chance of a contiguous move towards the sea. The Kurds have not lost everything, but they have been pushed back. The good news is that contrary to what many of us expected at the time, Kurdish governance east of the Euphrates has not collapsed in its entirety, and the American presence, which underlies that authority, has not departed in its entirety. And there are still around 1,000 United States service personnel in eastern Syria. And for as long as they are there, and no longer, by the way, no longer than that, but for as long as they are there, Kurdish de facto governance in Syria east of the Euphrates, around, by the way, 30% of the territory of Syria, will continue. As the questioner, I think, knows, the questioner regarding the oil, as the questioner knows, this 30% of Syria contains the great majority of Syria's meager but not inconsiderable oil resources. It also contains the best agricultural land in Syria. So it is certainly an area which some other people would like to get their hands on. You mentioned Turkey. Turkey would like to get its hands on that area, but the Assad regime, or Bashar Assad, certainly also wants it too. Assad's desperately short of money, and he wants very much to get his hands on that oil and the revenue pertaining to it. My own view is the following regarding what would be likely to happen. For as long as America is there, the Kurds will remain dominant and the current dispensation will continue. Should there be a serious sign that that reality is about to change, that's to say that the Americans are about to leave, I have little doubt that the Kurdish de facto authority will rush as quick as it can to Damascus to sort out the terms of its surrender and departure from existence to the Syrian regime. And that as a result of that, the regime will grant it some minimal verbal autonomy, and regime forces and Russian forces will cross the Euphrates, and the regime will reconstitute its control of that area prior to the possibility of a Turkish push southwards. The reason why I'm convinced that that's what will happen is because I know from my many conversations with Kurdish leaders and Kurdish people in Syria that they're much, much more frightened of the Turks than they are of the Assad regime. It doesn't mean that they like the Assad regime, they absolutely don't. And the Assad regime was brutally discriminatory against its Kurdish population, up to and including banning the use of the Kurdish language in schools and prohibiting people from giving their kids Kurdish names. But nevertheless, the brutality of the Assad regime pales in comparison to that of the Turks with regard to Kurdish population. The Kurds basically think the following: if Assad comes back, they'll have to get used to living under a quite brutal and repressive dictatorial system. But if the Turks come in, they'll be driven out of their homes. If the Turks come in, they'll become refugees. That's the way they consider it. So consequently, my answer to the question is that a Turkish push towards the oil fields of eastern Syria, of Deir ez-Zor, is very unlikely, not because the Turks wouldn't like to do it, but because if there's any signs of it becoming a possibility, the Kurds will rush the regime and the Russians in east of Euphrates, and thus it will be prevented. And let me just conclude by saying the reason I'm confident in saying that is because a version of that is exactly what happened in November and December 2019. The Turks started coming in, the Kurds invited the regime and the Russians in to face them, and the Turks then stopped moving forward.
Another question, at the peak of power of Islamic State in Iraq, former high military Iraqi commanders joined for strategic and pragmatic reasons temporary alliances with Islamic State. Now, of course, Islamic State is much less powerful. What can the Sunni population expect and aspire to in Iraq and the region?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question. As of now, frankly, there is a vacuum, I would suggest, of Sunni consequential political power in Western Iraq and in Eastern Syria, where the Sunnis, are the majority population to a great extent. This is of profound importance. Look, if we think of the two big Sunni Arab political projects in that space in the last 10 years, they are the Syrian rebellion, which was a Sunni Arab affair, and the Islamic State. And both of them have been more or less completely defeated. And this is a matter of profound importance. Where can the Sunnis now turn to? Well, there are a number of options, none of them particularly great from a Sunni Arab point of view. First of all, we would be remiss if we didn't note the fact that the de facto Kurdish authority east of the Euphrates, in Eastern Syria, is making a lot of efforts to try to integrate as best it can the Arab majority areas it controls in the Deir ez-Zor province, in the southern part of its domain. Efforts are being made, up to and including, the attempt to bring Arab officials in at highest level and to cultivate the tribes in those areas. It's proving very difficult, but there is an effort being made. There's no parallel effort really being made in Western Iraq, I have to say, and I know that area quite well too. There, I'm afraid, the Shia government's victory, as it perceives it over Islamic State, is being, displayed in the most crude way, up to and including, Shia militia posters on the walls in Mosul and harassment of Sunni population in those cities. This, I'm afraid, is part of the tit-for-tat nature of sectarianism. Salahuddin province and those areas where ISIS was strong were, as you mentioned in the question, the centers of support for the Saddam Hussein regime. People in that area have long memories. And anyway, 2003 wasn't even that long ago in an area which can judge memory by centuries rather than decades or years. People remember the Sunni ascendancy in Baghdad and what it meant for the Shia population. What's happening in Western Iraq is that the Shia, from their point of view, are kind of returning the compliment. So what are the options available for the Sunni population? Well, in the Iraqi case, unlike the Syrian case, there is, of course, an electoral system. There are elections. You are able to organize political parties. And I think what is clearly taking place is that there are Sunni lists and Sunni families, such as the Najafi family from Mosul and so on, which are looking to engage as best they can in Iraqi politics and get what they can out of the situation. There is, we've spent a lot of time this morning discussing Turkey, and I'm afraid here we go back to Turkey once again, because there is also a Turkish interest in this. The Turks are doing their best to try to organize among the Iraqi Sunnis and to present themselves as the champion, so to speak, of the Iraqi Sunnis. The Turks have a base, a military base, which they established unilaterally, a place called Bashika, outside of Mosul, where they train Sunni militants to fight against ISIS. And Turkey is putting money also and support into Sunni political formations in the Iraqi space. So one possible way forward could be to try to move towards the Turks and to get what they can out from the Turks in that ongoing process of sectarian competition. I'm afraid to say that, however, that it may well be that the path which a lot of young people will take is nevertheless back towards Sunni Islamist militancy. And in this regard, one should not ignore the fact that ISIS is still reckoned to have around 30,000 fighters in Syria and in Iraq, which means Eastern Syria, Western Iraq. They do have supply lines still. They do have money still. They do have weaponry still. They are active still. And I think we shouldn't be surprised if we come to see in the years ahead, I mean, the few years ahead, the rebirth to some level or another of Sunni jihadi Islamist insurgency in both Western Iraq and Eastern Syria. I don't say that it will be as consequential as the rise of Islamic State was. I think that depended on the coming together of a number of historic conditions, namely the Syrian civil war, the rise of Shia sectarianism in Baghdad, and so on and so forth at that moment. But nevertheless, I think this is likely. So the answer is they're coming out of it as they're coming out of the last 10 years as the losers, as the profound losers of what's taken place. They're currently looking around for options. They don't have very many good options. Turkey is one. The Gulf states have largely pulled out of that area. They're not interested anymore in engaging in that area. And the other option, I'm afraid, is Sunni Islamist militancy. And I wouldn't be surprised if quite a few of them choose once again to go down that road.
What is the background of the Houthi rebellion in Yemen? Could you tell just a little bit more about that? Somebody asks.
Mm-hmm. First and foremost, it's important to remember that this is a rebellion, a tribal rebellion at its root. And so when we refer to the Houthis, what is the Houthis? The Houthis is a clan. It's a powerful clan in northern Yemen who are Shia, and there is a considerable population of Shia. These are particular branch of the Shia world. There's the Zaidi Shias. It's a different branch of Shiism to the majority of Shias, including in Iraq and Iran, who are what we would call 12 Shia. So this is another branch of Shia, which has been in insurgency against the governments of Yemen, actually since 2004. So this is not something which just erupted 5 years ago. This is an ongoing insurgency, which this tribally led group has been engaged in for the last decade and a half. Now, for the first decade of its insurgency, this was something of an irritant and not more. Why? Again, this is the local application of the more general rule we were discussing before. Why were they only an irritant for the first 2 years? Because, of course, there was then a very powerful dictatorial, authoritarian government in Yemen, led by Ali Abdullah Saleh, now deceased President Ali Abdullah Saleh, a pro-Western dictator of long standing. Well, what happened in Yemen was that the Arab Spring came to Yemen, and the Arab Spring deposed Ali Abdullah Saleh, put in his place an elected government of Abdul Rabbi Mansour al-Hadi, who's still the legal president of Yemen. And this was a much weaker government. And as a result of the weakened nature of the state in Yemen, the Houthis were able to accelerate their insurgency and strengthen their insurgency. And in late 2014, they launched a conventional part, the conventional phase of their formerly guerrilla insurgency. And in no short order, they drove the forces of Hadi government out of the capital Sana'a. Very interesting to note that when they did so in alliance with the former president. That's the Ali Abdullah Saleh, who, by the way, was himself a Zaidi Shia by birth, even though nobody had ever thought that mattered very much for most of his career. Saleh aligned with the Houthis, took power in Sana'a and in a large swathe of northern Yemen. It's interesting to note that 2 years later, Saleh was killed by the Houthis. And a recent book by an Iranian writer called Arash Arizi about the late Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani, a very well-researched and serious book, alleges that Saleh was killed on the direct orders of Qasem Soleimani. May well be true. In any case, what we know is that he was killed by by the Houthis, and the Houthis then moved to dominate the capital and that area by themselves, without the alliance with the loyalists of the previous regime with whom they had taken the capital. Now, here's the thing. Much of this was of only minor interest to regional powers because there isn't a great deal in northern Yemen to interest the region as a whole or the world. But in early 2015, as the Houthis, or Ansar Allah movement as they are officially known, began to push southwards, there emerged a moment of real strategic challenge to pro-Western forces in the region. Why? Because at the foot of Yemen, if you look at the map, at the foot of Yemen, between there is a strait, S-T-R-A-I-T, yeah, a strait, which separates the Gulf of Aden, then the Indian Ocean, from the Red Sea. And this is a crucial waterway for ships, including ships carrying oil and gas from the Gulf up towards the Suez Canal and then on to the markets of Europe and elsewhere. Something like, I think it's 9% of all seaborne traveling oil and petroleum and refined petroleum products in the world travel through this strait. It is called Bab el-Mandeb, which means in Arabic, the gate of tears. And as the Houthis pushed southward, there emerged the very real possibility that they would reach Bab el-Mandeb. And the Houthis are, of course, an Iran-supported force who had begun not as a creation of Iran, as a local force, with some Iranian support, but as the Iranians realized the possibilities inherent in a Houthi insurgency, they began to pour increased support into the Houthis. And the possibility that emerged in early 2015 that the Houthis and therefore the Iranians could have reached the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Had they reached Bab el-Mandeb, it's not difficult to imagine the power and influence that would derive for the Iranians from the ability to choke off maritime traffic passing through Bab el-Mandeb. Think of the impact that could have on global oil supplies and on the global economy. So there was an urgent need to prevent them from reaching that goal. And as a result, a Saudi-led and Emirati-involved intervention of the Gulf countries in support of the Hadi government took place in 2015. They have proven unable to defeat the Houthis in their entirety, but they did hold the Houthis north of Bab el-Mandeb. That's say they did achieve the urgent strategic task that was facing them. Now, the result has been catastrophic unfortunately for the people of Yemen, and there are 3 million refugees, and there is hunger, famine inside the country, and unfortunately none of this shows any sign of being settled anytime soon. There was a stalemate on the front lines, and this is comparable to situations elsewhere in the Arab world, in Libya and in Syria. And the most important recent development has been the stated decision by President Biden to remove support for the Saudi effort inside Yemen and to end arms supplies for the Saudi effort in Yemen as part of the desire to achieve peace in Yemen. The problem with the desire to achieve peace in Yemen for the United States, of course, is that the United States only has leverage over one of the sides, namely the Saudi side, not over the pro-Iranian side. And so the immediate result of Biden's announcement has been something I mentioned at the beginning, which is the launching by the Iranians and the Houthis of an offensive on the oil town of Marib, which is the last remaining town in northern Yemen that the Houthis don't yet control. And it's the main oil terminal, so to speak, the main oil producing area inside Yemen. So if it falls to the Houthis, that's a very serious defeat indeed, and that's what's currently taking place. So that's where those are the essential points, and these essential points are common to a number of other arenas as well, namely the deposing of a powerful authoritarian regime, a war of succession fought out mainly along sectarian lines, and the intervention of outside powers supporting this or that one of the warring sides, and the resulting fragmentation and partial collapse of the state itself, with an ongoing stalemate along the front lines. So I hope that's some help in increasing understanding. And I would stress that Yemen is very important and is significantly underreported in European and American media. And there's a need for that to change, because we need to be thinking about this too.
Regarding Saudi Arabia, you mentioned the three key players in the region: Israel, Turkey, and Iran. What is the, somebody asks why you don't identify Saudi Arabia as a key player?
Saudi Arabia has been a key player, of course, in the region, but the reason why I wouldn't mention it in the same breath, so to speak, as Iran, Turkey, and Israel, is because Saudi Arabia, in common with Egypt, the other potential or natural leader, we could say, of the Arab world, so to speak, is facing profound internal challenges, profound, even potentially existential internal challenges, which must of necessity constitute the main items of attention for any Saudi government. And as a result of those urgent matters, it won't be possible for Saudi Arabia or for Egypt, this applies to Egypt too, to play the kind of outward-looking role in the region which these three other countries, or which countries seeking to engage as potential hegemons, so to speak, must surely play. What are the internal matters demanding the attention of Saudi leadership? Most importantly, the matter of the decline in importance, inevitable decline in importance of oil over the next, which will take place over the next 2 decades globally. This is coming, and everyone knows that it's coming. And Saudi Arabia knows that it's coming too, which means that the urgent task facing anybody ruling Saudi Arabia today will be the preparation for Saudi Arabia to emerge as a post-petrochemicals dominated economy. That's the first and foremost. If Saudi Arabia wishes to survive as a state. And MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince and Defense Minister, is centrally engaged on that matter. That's what the construction of the city of Neom, which is supposed to be a tourist and financial services city in Saudi Arabia, that's what the swathe of reforms, liberal reforms regarding the role of women in Saudi Arabia, not enough yet, but very considerable, are all about. They're about trying to prepare Saudi Arabia for a post-petrochemicals reality by, as we know, the year they have chosen, 2030. Right? This is called the Vision 2030 plan. Now, this is going to take up the attention of the Saudis, and they're not going to be able, therefore, to be key competitors for power across the spaces of the Middle East. And indeed, we see that when Saudi Arabia tries to engage in activities across the region, the relatively fragile and in some ways not fully modern nature of the Saudi state prevents them from doing particularly well. Saudi Arabia is not going to be able to carry the weight that America used to carry in this region. Now, this is simply not a possibility. And if we look at the Saudi performance in Syria, when they tried to go against the Iranians in the matter of proxy warfare, and the absolute chaotic humiliation which they suffered as a result of that, and also, to an extent, the shambolic and inconclusive nature of their intervention in Yemen that we discussed a moment ago, we see the way in which this is not a country built for purpose, if the purpose is to carry the weight of the departing American hegemon in the region. Saudis just aren't there. They're not able to carry that role, and they have a very urgent agenda facing them internally, which will prevent them from being able to devote sufficient attention to the region, which will be required of anybody who wants to play in the Premier League, so to speak, in the big league in which Turkey, Iran, and I would say also Israel are located. Anybody else? Probably this is the last question, I think.
Let me see, we have a last few questions.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Iran is seen as a threat by Israel. And a lot of times there's talks of a direct strike by Israel. Is there an alternative to a direct strike to stop Iran?
Well, what you hear from Israel and what we heard most recently from Chief of Staff Kochavi and other senior officials, which I think is a message they're trying very much to give to the Americans now, is that if Israel thinks that Iran is about to embark on the construction of a nuclear weapon, then at that point, the only alternative to a direct strike will be to accept nuclear Iran. And Israel says very clearly that it doesn't wish to accept the nuclear Iran. So at that point, there'll be no alternative to a direct strike. I think it's very important to stress, and I think that officials here do note, that we are not yet at that point, and we are indeed not yet anywhere really near that point. And the time which is usually given by Israeli officials from that it would take for Iran to achieve a nuclear weapons capacity, should it choose to embark on one or trying to get one tomorrow morning, so to speak, is 2 years. That's the official Israeli estimate, which means a lot can be done, even if they were to choose to try to rush forward to that capacity right now, necessitating a strike at some point to prevent it. So the alternative then, I think in the Israeli point of view, and that of others also, to reaching that point is placing Iran under sufficient pressure that the Iranians will not wish to attempt to embark on such a task. And that can be done within the framework of an agreement, of course, which subjects Iran to sanctions and punishment if it leaves the framework of that agreement, and to benefits potentially if it stays in the agreement. Or it can be done, as America has been trying to do for the last 2 years, outside of the framework of an agreement, where you just say to Iran, okay, we're putting you under a level of pressure which can be increased should you choose to embark again on the path towards nuclear weapons. I think a very good case can be made for either of those situations. They're both doable, but in any case, now we're into a situation very clearly where we're heading back towards a nuclear negotiation and maybe a new nuclear agreement further down the line. In all those situations, the alternative to inevitable military action to prevent an Iran rushing towards nuclear weapons is the continued pressure on Iran, which may well deter the Iranians from wishing to embark down that path. That's the alternative. There isn't really any other. And you can do that from within an agreement or not within an agreement. And that's what we're going to be trying very hard to do. From an Israeli, what will be the Israeli contribution to such a kind of ongoing process of pressure against the Iranians? Well, it looks like the Israeli contribution will be a kind of ongoing, very quiet campaign of direct action against the Iranian nuclear capacity, which kind of keeps the Iranians confused and disorientated in the nuclear realm by the kind of tactics which you know about, which we read about in our newspapers, and which we assume Israel may be responsible for. Mysterious explosions in Natanz, mysterious killings of senior scientists, and so on and so forth.
As you mentioned, you would take one final question.
Sure.
So somebody asks, does the European Union, have any relevancy in the current and future situation in the Middle East?
Various European countries are major investors and have major historic roles, we can say, in a number of Middle Eastern countries. The French role in Lebanon, for example, is very significant, and Macron has traveled to Lebanon on a couple of occasions and is trying his best to help to sort out the political problems there, which prevent any attention given to the economic problems. We can say that the British role in Iraq is in some way similar, the British role also in the Gulf, and so on and so forth. So I think that the EU as a whole, the EU as an entity has very limited strategic or diplomatic role to play, but significant EU countries are playing significant but second line roles in a number of Middle Eastern spaces. There is major European economic investment in a number of regional countries, and I think it has proven frustrating to many European countries that they haven't managed to translate, or they don't manage to translate that economic involvement into political and diplomatic power. Frankly, I suspect that situation is likely to remain. I don't see any major change in that regard. The emergent powers in our region, in addition to the retreating or recalibrating United States, are without any serious doubt Russia and China. And these are the global powers which are going to be playing in various ways an increased role, or are playing an increased role in the area. And I think that the role of European countries is inevitably going to be secondary in that regard. I don't see that changing anytime soon. And I think that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is maybe an example of that, where the Europeans for a long period have wanted very much to play a more direct political and diplomatic role, but have found themselves unable to come in with sufficient clout, so to speak, that they can insist on being heard. And as a result, they've tended to be largely ignored. Having said that, I don't want to present a simplistic picture in that regard. One of the countries I work closely on is Syria. And in Syria, the EU's quite firm stance demanding a process of political transition before allowing financial support for reconstruction in Syria for the Assad regime is proving to be of very real political significance. Assad is very weak, and Assad is being kept weak largely by a European decision in this regard. A decision, by the way, which I completely support on a personal level. And I think this is an example where, this is a rare example where the Europeans are managing to turn their economic muscle into diplomatic and political muscle. But largely, they find themselves frustrated in doing so to some degree, frankly, because of their inability to provide hard power in large measure in the region. At the end of the day, the reason why the Russians and the Iranians and Assad, just an example, have to listen to the Americans in eastern Syria is because the Americans have boots on the ground in eastern Syria. And no less importantly, because the Americans have massive air power in the Gulf and in Qatar, which they can employ very quickly to help their boots on the ground. And that means you can't ignore them, even if you want to ignore them. The Europeans aren't able to deploy power in a comparable way. And as a result, I think they'll carry on being ignored and probably being frustrated too.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jonathan Spire. Dank aan alle kijkers thuis. Dit was alweer de 8e lezing van de CIDI-informatiereeks. Volgende week, woensdag op 10 maart, hebben we professor van Koningsbrugge van de Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. Hij zal ingaan op Rusland en het Midden-Oosten. Maar een dag eerder, op 9 maart, in aanloop naar de Tweede Kamerverkiezingen, organiseert het CIDI een online Midden-Oosten verkiezingsdebat. Traditiegetrouw organiseert CIDI een debat. Ditmaal in verband met de coronacrisis kunnen we helaas alleen de 6 grootste partijen uitnodigen. Desondanks belooft het een zeer spannend debat te worden tussen de 6 grootste partijen. Tijdens het debat kunt u ook meedoen, kunt u meestemmen met stellingen, vragen stellen. En u kunt dit dus online meekijken. U kunt hierover meer informatie vinden op de CIDI-website. Wilt u deze lezingen steunen? Dat kan. Hiervoor kunt u ook informatie vinden op de website van CIDI. And once again, thank you very much, Dr. Jonathan Spire.
Thank you very much.